I turned my school into a Bobcat rescue 30 days before demolition. This is what happened. The roar of the diesel engine outside the window shook the water glass on the desk, creating small ripples on the liquid's surface. A layer of chalk dust drifted down from the ceiling onto the shoulder of Arthur Vance's threadbare suit jacket. He did not brush it away. In 43 years of teaching at Blackwood Academy, chalk dust had become as much a part of him as his gray hair and the deep lines etched around his eyes. Bang! Frankie Miller slammed a paper bearing a bright red stamp onto the oak desk. The paper slid across the surface, coming to a halt right at the edge. Demolition order. Execution in 30 days. The letters seemed to pulse with finality, each one a nail in the coffin of the institution that had stood on this hill since 1881. You have exactly 30 days to clear out this pile of memories. Mr. Vance, Frankie said, his voice grumpy like that of a man working their overtime, but his eyes avoiding the gaze of his old teacher. After that, my bulldozers will flatten this place. No exceptions. Arthur said nothing. He merely slowly adjusted his spectacle frames, looking at the portrait of the school's founder on the wall, which had just been tilted 15 degrees by the tremor. Elias Blackwood stared down at him from the oil painting, stern and dignified in his Victorian collar, the way he had stared down at generations of students who had passed through these halls. Outside, the giant yellow bulldozer let out another roar before ramming hard into the west foundation of the annex. A dry, cracking sound rang out, running along the base of the cold stone wall like a fracture spreading through ice. Frankie shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way he used to do when he was 12 years old and standing before Arthur's desk, caught cheating on a mathematics exam. That had been 17 years ago. The boy who once cried in this very office was now the man holding the hammer. I know this is difficult, sir, Frankie added quietly, but the investors won't wait. The resort project is scheduled to break ground in May. A resort? Arthur almost smiled at the absurdity. Blackwood Academy, which had educated senators and scientists, poets and physicians, would become a place where wealthy people came to drink cocktails by a swimming pool. Progress, they called it. He called it erasure. I understand, Arthur finally said, his voice steady despite the trembling he felt in his chest. 30 days. After Frankie left, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor like the retreat of an army. Arthur sat alone in the gathering dusk. He did not turn on the lights. Electricity had been cut off 3 weeks ago, shortly after the last staff members had collected their final paychecks and disappeared into their new lives. The school that once buzzed with the voices of 300 students was now a monument to silence. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and extracted a leather flask, unscrewing the cap with hands that had grown more unsteady with each passing year. The whiskey burned his throat, a small fire against the cold that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the building. On the wall behind him hung photographs spanning 4 decades, young faces frozen in time, many of them now middle-aged, scattered across the country, living lives that no longer intersected with this place. Arthur wondered how many of them even remembered Blackwood, how many would care that it was about to vanish. That night, Blackwood Academy was submerged in darkness and silence, save for the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of broken doors. Arthur sat eating dinner alone in the duty room with a tin of cheap canned tuna. The label was half peeled off, revealing rust spots on the metal beneath. The flickering flashlight cast his shadow against the wall, elongated and solitary, a distorted version of himself that seemed to mock his isolation. He thought about his wife, Celeste, who had died 6 years ago in the spring. She had loved this school almost as much as he did, had taught English literature in the very room where the bulldozer had struck this afternoon. Sometimes, in the quiet moments like this, he could almost hear her voice reciting Tennyson, the cadence of her words floating through the empty halls like a ghost refusing to leave. Thump, rustle, crash. Strange noises emanated from the great library. The place considered the heart of the school now stopped beating. Arthur paused his chewing, the tuna suddenly tasteless in his mouth. He set his spoon down carefully, wiped his fingers on a napkin, and grabbed the old baseball bat leaning in the corner of the room. The bat had been confiscated from a student in 1987, a boy named Tommy Fletcher, who had broken 3 windows in the dormitory. Arthur had kept it all these years, never quite sure why. The instincts of an old soldier and a strict principal flared up. He had served in Korea before becoming a teacher, had learned to move quietly through dangerous spaces, to control his breathing, to push fear into a small box at the back of his mind. He was certain that the hooligans from town had sneaked in again to spray graffiti or smash whatever remained. They had already painted obscenities across the gymnasium walls, had shattered the stained glass window in the chapel that had been donated by the class of 1923. Arthur crept toward the double oak doors, his hand gripping the handle of the bat, heart pounding against his ribs like a prisoner demanding release. Yet his footsteps kept a decisive rhythm. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The meditation technique Celeste had taught him during his worst nightmares. When Korea came back to him in the dark, 4, 5, 6, he took a deep breath, kicked the door open, switched on his flashlight, and shouted into the darkness. Get out right now, the police are on their way. There were no thugs. In the blinding white beam of the flashlight, a scene of chaos revealed itself. On the dusty floor, the massive wall-mounted world map had been pulled down, its canvas torn and crumpled, and the intruders were 8 tiny balls of fluff with pointed ears, enthusiastically clawing and tearing at the continents as if geography itself had offended them. One was devouring South America, tiny teeth shredding Brazil into confetti. Another was trying to excavate the Atlantic Ocean, its claws catching on the thick paper and pulling it into strips. Arthur lowered the bat slowly, his tensed shoulders suddenly slumping in astonishment. He swept the flashlight beam toward the corner of the wall, where a large crack had been caused by Frankie's bulldozer that afternoon. The gap was wide enough for a cat to slip through, jagged edges of brick and mortar creating a primitive doorway. The warmth from inside the school had escaped through that fissure, enticing these shivering small creatures to enter. Human destruction had inadvertently opened a passage for nature to invade, a poetic justice that was not lost on Arthur. A kitten looked up at him, its mouth still clamping a scrap of paper shaped like the Florida Peninsula, its golden eyes showing no fear. The eyes were wild and bright, reflecting the flashlight beam like tiny suns. This was not a domestic animal seeking human comfort. This was a survivor, opportunistic and fierce, taking shelter where it could be found. Arthur knelt down slowly, his knees protesting with sharp pains he had learned to ignore. He examined the kittens more closely. Lynxes, he realized. Canada lynxes, judging by the oversized paws and the tufted ears. They were perhaps 6 or 7 weeks old, still clumsy with their movements but already showing the muscular build of apex predators. Their mother must have denned nearby, perhaps in the old groundskeeper's cottage that had been abandoned for a decade. She must have been desperate to bring them into a human structure. Even one as dead as Blackwood had become. Arthur sighed, a long exhale that carried with it the weariness of old age and something else. Something he had not felt in years, purpose. So, it is a tiny gang, he said softly. He stood up, his mind already working through the problem like a mathematical equation. 8 lynx kittens, 30 days until demolition. A mother somewhere outside who would return for them. The logical solution was to call animal control. Let professionals handle the situation. But Arthur Vance had spent his entire adult life rejecting logical solutions in favor of educational ones. He looked at the kittens destroying his beloved map, and he saw not pests, but students. In the days that followed, Blackwood Academy was no longer a haunted house. It became a special training camp. Arthur Vance, who had spent his life educating stubborn human children, now applied those pedagogical methods to 8 wild lynxes with the same rigor he had once applied to teaching calculus and Latin. He retrieved an old brass handbell from storage, an object that had lain dormant for 2 decades, since the school had modernized its bell system with electric buzzers. The bell had been forged in 1881, the same year the school was founded, and its surface was covered with the green patina of age. Arthur spent the entire morning polishing it with a rag and vinegar until it gleamed, until he could see his warped reflection in the curved brass surface. Clang, clang, clang. The bell rang out, clear and authoritative, echoing through the deserted corridors, piercing through the dust of time like a voice from the past demanding to be heard. That was the signal, initially. The kittens were startled, puffing up their fur until they looked like dandelions with legs, scattering in 8 different directions. But Arthur was patient. Patience was the foundation of all good teaching. After the bell came food. After the bell came safety. He had learned this principle with humans, and he found it applied equally well to wild animals. The food came from his own rapidly dwindling savings. He drove his ancient pickup truck to the butcher shop in town 3 times a week, buying chicken scraps and beef bones at the butcher. A former Blackwood student named Dale Morris sold to him at cost. Dale never asked why a 70-year-old man living alone in a condemned school needed 20 pounds of raw meat. Some questions were better left unspoken. Arthur was not just calling them to eat. He was teaching them reflexes, conditioning them the way Pavlov had conditioned his dogs, creating neural pathways that would serve them long after Blackwood was rubble. Every time the bell rang, Arthur observed their reactions with the keen eye of a scientist. He wanted them to understand that this sound was a rallying signal, a crucial survival skill for pack living in the wild. Lynxes were typically solitary, but these 8 had the advantage of siblinghood, of learning to hunt and defend together. The brass bell chiming in the empty school created a powerful sense of nostalgia, as if Arthur were trying to maintain the pulse of Blackwood, keeping the school's heart beating faintly until the very last moments. He named them, though he knew he should not form such attachments. The largest male he called Major, for his commanding presence. The smallest, most mischievous one became Pip. There was Ruckus, always causing chaos. Scout, who explored every corner. Duchess, regal and aloof. Bandit, with distinctive dark markings around her eyes. Widget, constantly fiddling with objects. And finally, Ink, whose fur was the darkest of the litter. But Arthur did not raise them as pets. He was a headmaster, and a headmaster needs diligent staff, not freeloaders. This was a principle he had maintained throughout his career. Every student at Blackwood had been required to contribute to the community, whether through groundskeeping, kitchen duty, or tutoring younger students. These lynxes would be no different. When he discovered that sewer rats were attacking the archives in the underground cellar, threatening 100-year-old chronicles and record books that documented every student who had ever walked through Blackwood's doors, Arthur decided this would be their first internship. Instead of setting traps or using poison, every night, he opened the heavy cellar door, the one that squealed on rusted hinges, and herded the army of 8 lynxes down into the darkness. "Your assignment for tonight," Arthur said sternly to the cats sitting in a row before the pitch-black cellar door, his voice taking on the same tone he had used with countless nervous freshmen, "is to protect history." The kittens stared at him with luminous eyes, and then, as if they understood, they descended into the cellar like soldiers entering battle. Arthur could hear them moving in the darkness below, the scrabble of claws on stone, the occasional growl, the squeaks of panicked rodents. The next morning, he went down to inspect, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The skittering sounds of rats were gone, replaced by a profound silence. On the floor, several rat carcasses lay like war trophies, arranged almost ceremonially. Arthur pulled a leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket, took out a fountain pen, the same pen he had used to write recommendation letters for Harvard and Yale, and carefully made an entry. He did not write cost of raising cats, but rather inscribed the line, security staff salary, 3 rats per night, performance excellent. It was a fairness full of pride. He was not giving them handouts, and they were repaying him with labor and instinct to elevate their hunting skills to a new level. Arthur utilized the remnants of technology. The school's public address system still worked intermittently, powered by a backup generator that wheezed and coughed but refused to die. He sat in the broadcasting room, where dust coated the buttons and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like dirty lace, feeling like a disc jockey of the wild world. Arthur spent 3 days recording sounds. He stood in the forest at dawn, capturing bird songs on an old cassette recorder. He waited by the edge of the property at dusk, recording the sounds of rabbits running through dry leaves. He even recorded the rats in the cellar before the lynxes had eliminated them, preserving their squeaks for posterity. Then he played these recordings randomly through speakers positioned throughout the school, in the music room, the cafeteria, the laboratory, the chapel, In the library, where the lynxes had made their primary den among the toppled bookshelves, the sleeping pack suddenly sprang up, ears swiveling like radar dishes, bodies tensing with predatory focus. Squeak, squeak, squeak emanated from a speaker in the east wing. The entire pack darted off, claws clicking lightly on the wooden floor, triangulating the sound through thick stone walls with remarkable accuracy. Arthur watched via the fuzzy security camera monitor, one of the few systems still functioning, smiling as he saw them pounce on the speaker mounted on the wall in the instrument room. They attacked it with savage enthusiasm, as if the speaker itself were prey. He turned the collapsing school into an auditory maze, where every lesson was a step of preparation for the harsh life outside. He varied the sounds, the volumes, the locations. He taught them to differentiate between the chirp of a sparrow and the call of a crow, between the rustle of a mouse and the heavier tread of a raccoon. He was preparing them for a world he would never see them inhabit, and the irony was not lost on him. At night, Arthur sat in his office and wrote in his journal, documenting every detail of their progress. Week 1, visual acuity developing rapidly, all subjects able to track moving objects at distance. Week 2, pack coordination improving, observe cooperative hunting behavior during rat elimination exercise. Week 3, response to auditory cues excellent, suggest increased complexity in training scenarios. He wrote as if he were submitting a research paper, as if someone, someday, might care about what he had accomplished in these final days. In truth, he wrote because it gave structure to his solitude, because it reminded him that he was still a teacher, still a man of purpose. However, time was not on their side. 30 days passed as quickly as the blink of an eye, each one bleeding into the next in a blur of bells and raw meat and the soft padding of paws on ancient floors. On the 29th day, Frankie Miller returned, his footsteps pounded heavily on the wooden corridor. No longer the hesitant tread of a guilty former student, but the confident stride of a man with a job to do. He had come to urge Arthur to leave earlier than scheduled due to project progress, to ensure the old man would not be present when the demolition began. He walked into the library with a scowling face, ready to shout, ready to be firm, but Frankie froze. Under a sun-drenched windowsill, a mischievous kitten named Ruckus was engrossed in batting a small, dusty object across the floor. It tossed the object up with its paw, then pounced on it with exaggerated ferocity, pushing it back and forth like a hockey player practicing alone. Frankie squinted, stepping closer, his work boots crunching on debris. It was a toy car made of metal painted red, the paint almost entirely peeled off. One wheel bent to the side, frozen in a permanent turn. The car was perhaps 3 inches long, weathered and ancient, a relic from another era. This, Frankie stammered, his voice suddenly wavering, losing all its official authority. This is mine. I lost it in the 4th grade. I thought it had been thrown away. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He was 10 years old again, small for his age, always picked last for sports. He had been playing with the car during recess, racing it along the windowsill in the very room where he now stood. Another boy, bigger and meaner, had grabbed it from him, had thrown it across the room where it disappeared into a gap in the floorboards. Frankie had cried, and Mr. Vance had found him there, had promised to retrieve the car, but somehow it had never been found. Until now. Arthur stood leaning against a bookshelf, taking off his glasses to wipe them with a handkerchief he kept in his breast pocket. Student Ruckus found it under the rotting floorboards yesterday, he said calmly. He has excavated quite a few things that you students left behind. Frankie looked at the wild cat playing with his childhood keepsake. This creature that knew nothing of human nostalgia yet had somehow become the archaeologist of his lost innocence. He looked at Arthur, the old teacher calmly stacking the last few books into a cardboard box, moving with deliberate slowness, as if time had ceased to matter. The aggression of a construction foreman vanished, leaving only the flustered state of the former student. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight, and he bent down to pick up the car. The metal was cold in his palm, heavier than he remembered. He could see his own fingerprints in the dust coating its surface, could remember exactly how it had felt to push it across his bedroom floor, making engine noises with his mouth. imagining himself as a race car driver, as someone important, as someone other than the scared little boy he had been. He placed it back on the floor for Ruckus to continue playing. "Tomorrow," Frankie said softly, his eyes still fixed on the car as the kitten batted it across the floor. "The demolition crew won't start until noon tomorrow. Sir, I will report that the bulldozer had a technical malfunction. You have one more night." "Thank you," Arthur said simply. After Frankie left, walking slower than he had arrived, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight, Arthur stood alone in the library and allowed himself a moment of weakness. He sat down on a reading chair, its cushion flat and stained, and he wept, not for himself, but for all the Frankie Millers who had passed through these halls, who had left pieces of themselves embedded in the floorboards and walls, who would never know that their fragments had been preserved, however briefly, by wild creatures who cared nothing for human memory. On the final night, Arthur did not sleep. He wore his most formal black suit, the one he had worn to Celeste's funeral, the one he wore to graduation ceremonies when he handed diplomas to young people stepping into their futures. He tied the silk cravat he reserved only for the most solemn occasions, his fingers fumbling with the knot, muscle memory from decades of practice guiding him through the motions. He did not use food to lure them out. He no longer needed to do so. The training was complete. Sable, the mother of the kittens, had appeared in the schoolyard at dusk, waiting patiently at the edge of the tree line. Arthur had spotted her through the window, her larger form unmistakable in the fading light. She knew it was time. Mothers always knew. Arthur threw open the two large iron gates of Blackwood Academy, gates that had been locked and unlocked 10,000 times over the decades, gates that had welcomed the most elite students and sent off those who had completed their mission. The hinges groaned in protest, and the night wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine forests, the smell of freedom, and the cold wilderness that had existed long before Blackwood and would exist long after. "Let us go," Arthur said, his voice warm and steady, without a tremor, though his heart was breaking in ways he had not anticipated. Sable growled softly in her throat, a sound of acknowledgement, of gratitude perhaps, though Arthur knew better than to anthropomorphize. She turned and walked away, her gait confident and powerful. One by one, the students stepped out of the library, passed through the great hall where countless assemblies had been held, and descended the worn stone steps that had been climbed by generations of young people now scattered across the world. They passed Arthur in a strangely orderly fashion, almost as if they were processing in a graduation line. Scout went first, pausing to sniff the air, then Duchess and Bandit together, moving in synchronized steps. Widget and Ink followed, and then Pip, the smallest, who looked back once before continuing. Ruckus bounded past with characteristic enthusiasm. Major, the largest male of the pack, was the last to leave. As he passed where Arthur stood solemnly like a sentinel, like a headmaster watching his final class depart, he stopped. He looked up at him, deep amber eyes reflecting the image of the old man in the starlight. The moment stretched between them, human and animal, teacher and student, two beings who had shared space and purpose for 30 days that felt both infinite and impossibly brief. Then Major approached, closing the distance with slow deliberation, and rubbed his head firmly against Arthur's trouser leg just once. A brief, rough touch, but one containing the gratitude of a wild beast, the acknowledgement of care received, of lessons learned. It was more than Arthur had expected, more than he deserved. After that, Major turned and decisively darted after his mother and siblings into the pitch-black night of the old forest, his powerful legs carrying him into a life that Arthur could only imagine. Arthur stood there for a long time, until the last tail had completely disappeared into the darkness, until even the sound of their movement through the underbrush had faded to nothing. He pulled the heavy gates shut with both hands, the metal cold against his palms. A dry clang rang out as the latch fell into place. "Final and absolute, you have graduated," he whispered into the void, into the empty courtyard where no one remained to hear him. He walked back to his office, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors one last time. He sat at his desk and pulled out the leather notebook, opening it to a fresh page, in careful script. He wrote the final entry. Class of 2024, 8 students. Species Canada lynx. Graduation status successful. Placement wilderness. Probability of survival high. Teaching methodology classical conditioning with modern technological integration. Personal assessment most rewarding class of career. He closed the notebook and placed it in his suitcase, along with his fountain pen, a photograph of Celeste, and the brass bell that had called his final students to order. The next morning, when the library wall collapsed under the ruthless bucket of the bulldozer, dust billowed up, obscuring the sky like a toxic cloud. The sound of shattering stone and brick sounded like breaking bones, like the death rattle of something ancient and irreplaceable. Workers shouted to each other, their voices harsh and functional. The machines roared and beeped, modern efficiency destroying what had taken decades to build. But Arthur Vance did not look at the rubble. He stood at a distance, leaning on his cane, a concession to age he had recently been forced to make. Holding his small suitcase in his other hand, his eyes were directed toward the dark green tree lines on the high hill beyond the property. Somewhere in that wilderness, 8 lynxes were learning to hunt real prey, to avoid real danger, to live the lives they were meant to live. He smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. His school had not collapsed. It had simply changed locations. Education, he had always believed, was not confined to buildings and books. It was the transmission of knowledge and skills from one generation to the next, the preparation of the young for the challenges that awaited them. By that definition, Blackwood Academy was still very much alive, 1 year later. The site of Blackwood Academy did not become a resort as planned. The investors had discovered unstable groundwater during geological surveys, underground streams that made the foundation unsuitable for large structures. The lawsuit and counter-lawsuit had dragged on for months, and eventually, the land had been sold to the county for a fraction of its projected value. It became a quiet green park, a public space maintained by volunteers, a place where families came to picnic and children played on swings installed where the gymnasium had once stood. Arthur, now older and frailer, his cane a permanent fixture rather than an occasional aid, leaned on it heavily as he returned to visit the old grounds. It was spring, and the air smelled of cut grass and blooming wildflowers. He had not been back since the day of demolition, had not wanted to see the destruction, but something had called him here on this particular afternoon. Grass had grown green and lush, covering the scars of the earth like skin healing over a wound. He strolled around the area that used to be the foundation of the annex building, where Frankie's bulldozer had first struck, where the crack in the wall had appeared and changed everything. His eyes suddenly stopped at an old slab of concrete remaining there, half hidden beneath wild weeds and purple clover. On the gray, rough surface of the concrete, a tiny footprint was clearly imprinted, preserved as if the cement had been wet yesterday rather than a year ago. It was the footprint of Pip, the youngest and most mischievous kitten, the one who had stepped into wet cement during a minor repair Arthur had attempted in the 3rd week, for which Arthur had scolded him with mock severity. Now, that footprint had fossilized. It became an eternal relic, the sole evidence that life had once sprouted and been protected in this place. That learning had occurred in the final days of a dying institution. Arthur slowly sat down on the grass beside the concrete, his old bones protesting. His breathing labored from the walk. His wrinkled, trembling hand placed itself upon the tiny footprint, fingers tracing the delicate outline of 4 toes and a pad. The concrete was cold, warmed only slightly by the spring sun, but his heart felt strangely warm, a warmth that spread through his chest and into his limbs, a feeling he recognized as contentment, a rare emotion in the landscape of his grief and loss. He closed his eyes, and in the rustling wind of the park, in the laughter of children playing in the distance, he imagined he could still hear the sound of the brass bell. Clang, clang, clang. It echoed somewhere nearby, not in his ears, but in his memory, in the part of his brain that held 43 years of bells and lessons and young faces turning toward him with questions in their eyes. The bell was calling them to order, calling them to attention, calling them to learn. And somewhere in the forest beyond the park, 8 lynxes who had once been his students moved through the trees, hunting and surviving, carrying with them the reflexes and skills he had given them. Arthur opened his eyes and looked up at the sky, where clouds moved slowly across the blue expanse. "Thank you," he said quietly, though he was not sure who he was thanking. Celeste, perhaps, for teaching him patience. The lynxes, for giving his final day's purpose. Blackwood itself, for standing long enough to house one last class. Or perhaps he was thanking himself for having the wisdom to recognize that teaching could take many forms, that students could have four legs instead of two, that education was not about buildings, but about the transfer of knowledge from those who knew to those who needed to learn. He stood up slowly, using his cane for support, and took one last look at the footprint before turning to leave. As he walked away from the park, from the ghost of Blackwood Academy, from the concrete evidence that his final class had existed, he felt lighter than he had in years. The past was preserved in that tiny footprint, and the future was running wild in the forest. And that, Arthur Vance decided, was exactly as it should be.